When you like Ventura TV Appliance on Facebook, it's nice. But when you love the Samsung big screen we deliver, it's even better. Our website is cool, and it's a good place to start. But you really should touch the merchandise before you buy. Time for that upgrade to an HD 3D web-enabled Samsung TV. Get the best selection, price, and service in town without waiting. Come in to Ventura TV Appliance and touch the merchandise today.
Hi, I'm John Malos. Welcome to this live edition of Connect with Me on the showroom floor at Ventura TV on this Monday morning. It's on the air off the presses on this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. 436 Me TV option 11. We'll talk a little bit about King's legacy, and also we'll talk about terrorism, not only overseas, but here at home. Back in just a moment.
Tonight I want to discuss the importance of the television medium to the American people.
Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
What a moment it was way back in 1963, the March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with that I Have a Dream speech, unforgettable on this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day we celebrate here on Connect with Me along with the rest of the country. It's now a national holiday across all 50 states, as it should be. Welcome you to the program here on Me TV Fresno. You're watching us on Comcast channel 187, 43.6 and now 13.1. You can watch the replay later today, of course, at 2 o'clock on 13.6 and 8 o'clock tonight on 13.5. Our program today sponsored by Dr. Thomas Casagrande, the owner of 2020 Optometrics. Check him out. He's over there at Shaw and Blackstone or nearby, right in the same parking lot with more furniture. He's got more than 2,000 frames to choose from. Hey, before we get to the main topic of our program today, I do want to mention this water thing. Big issue or article in yesterday's issue of the Fresno Bee. It was a special Sunday article by George Hostetter, quoted Doug Begum. It showed you how the process works. Let's put up the picture of Mark Standrift, the communications director for the city of Fresno. You know, if you got any questions about this water rates hike or this issue, you can call Mark at 621-8000. We haven't been able to reach him. The recording is 621-8618. It'll give you instructions, but if you go to Hostetter's piece yesterday in the Fresno Bee, it'll give you all the instructions and the deadline, and I believe they need 66,000 of these returned by you, the residents of Fresno, to overturn any possible water rate hike. All you have to do is check the box, sign that card, mail it back in by February the 5th, and they need 66,000. I believe that's a little over half of the residents here in the city of Fresno that have water meters. Anyway, our program today, the fears of terrorism continue to spread throughout the entire area in Europe. This after Charlie Hebdo, the attack there in Paris, and then last Friday, more terror across Europe, although nothing really happened except they made some arrests and shot 2 people. Let's go to the videotape. I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. In Brussels, police carried out an anti-terror attack, killing 2 suspects, arresting a 3rd, detaining at least a dozen people. The suspects had automatic weapons with plans to target law enforcement officials. They wanted to kill policemen, and one report said they wanted to behead them and post the video on YouTube. They also planned to carry out attacks in nearby Germany and France, where a train station was closed after a bomb threat and 2 arrests were made. Back here at home, the 20-year-old Cincinnati man under arrest last week, charged in a plot to bomb the U.S. Capitol and government officials. His name is Christopher Lee Cornell. He told an FBI informant that he planned to blow up the Capitol with pipe bombs, then start shooting and killing people. Federal agents took Cornell down at the point-blank gun range in Cincinnati last week after buying automatic weapons and ammunition. Authorities say they've been tracking this guy Cornell since last year and that he recently converted to Islam. Live in our studio now is Bradley Hart, a journalism professor at Fresno State who recently returned from Europe. He recently came back from London, was going to take a side trip to Paris, decided not to. We'll talk to him about this. You know, neither one of us are terrorism experts, but certainly we can talk about this from a media perspective, and so can you. 436 MeTV option 11. Dr. Thomas Casagrande, our sponsor today. We're back in a moment. At 2020 Optometric, your vision is their focus. Whether you're 5 or 65, Dr. Thomas Casagrande will get to know you, your lifestyle, and vision needs to ensure that your contacts or eyeglasses are a perfect fit and the right prescription every time. With the Valley's largest selection of eyewear, 2020 has over 2,000 frames, including top designer brands like Coach, Tiffany, Prada, Ray-Ban, Oakley, and more. Eye exams start as low as $89, so call or stop by to schedule your appointment today.
The Valley's Classic Vinyl headquarters carries an inventory of over 500,000 classic LPs. Choose from rock, rhythm and blues, country, jazz, and oldies but goodies. Spinners also buys and sells fully restored old school stereo gear and LP. You can now get a turntable receiver and speakers for below $250. We carry name brands like Marantz, Sansui, and Pioneer.
At Spinners, we sell memories.
Spinners Records at 639 East Olive Avenue in the Tower District.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Dr. Martin Luther King on April the 3rd, the night before he was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. April 3rd, 1968. Bradley Hart is here now. Kind of runs chills up and down your spine to hear that, even so many years later.
Absolutely. I've seen it many times, and just now I was getting chills actually watching it. I mean, an unbelievable speech, obviously, and what happens later, I mean, just, it's impossible to view, I think, without thinking about that. Yeah,
I know. And even if you were to transcribe that speech, which many people have done, I don't think anybody in America today could deliver that speech the way Dr. King did on that night. Just the way, his delivery, his demeanor, nobody could do it like him.
Well, indeed, and I think, I mean, King is obviously a unique historical figure in the sense that he's able to harness all of these divergent forces in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and really point them in a single direction. There was no assurance that that was going to take place effectively. So he is a unique figure in that way, and that's of course why there's a holiday for him today.
Yeah. Hey, why did it, before we get into the terrorism thing, why did it take so long for like Utah and Arizona to come into the fold for this national holiday?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Martin Luther King Jr., we tend to forget today, was a very controversial figure in his own time, and there is a side of King that we don't talk about so much. I mean, we remember him for his civil rights campaigning, but he's also a very aggressive anti-poverty campaigner at the time, and also very aggressively anti-Vietnam. So this is a figure who is very controversial in his own time, and obviously the controversy that went on, I think, until the late 1990s over Martin Luther King Jr. Day obviously is a reflection of that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the movie Selma. I don't know if you have yet, but from what you've read and studied, what was his relationship with President Johnson at the time?
Yeah, I mean, this is one controversial point of this film, right, that it shows that Johnson is sort of moderately anti-civil rights, and there's a former Johnson aide who's come out in the past few weeks and said, no, that's completely inaccurate, and of course Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, you know, I haven't seen the film, so I don't know how it represents Johnson, but from my personal research into this, I mean, it appears that Johnson is very heavily pro-civil rights and really is able to harness the power of the Southern Democrats, or at least keep them from vetoing civil rights legislation.
And he had Johnson's ear.
Well,
he had his ear.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and the Civil Rights Act, we forget, is an incredible political achievement at the time, right? I mean, there's really been no significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction at that point, a century before. So Johnson is really the key president who brings this about. And again, I don't know how he's portrayed in the film, but I know that is a point of contention about it.
Yeah, you know, that film actually should be mandatory and required viewing by every student across the state of California, maybe the country, I think.
Indeed, and in a lot of cities, as we were talking earlier, actually, it is possible for students to get free tickets. Unfortunately, not here in Fresno, but in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, there is a website, I think it's selmaforstudents.com or something along those lines, where you can actually get free tickets if you're a student.
Yeah, not required reading at this point, but required viewing. It should be across the fruited plain across the U.S. But anyway, let's talk about terrorism now. And you just came back from Europe. You were in Europe at the time of the Charlie Hebdo thing.
I was.
The shootout that took place there. It really wasn't a shootout. It was a mass killing is what it was by terror groups. What's the sense that you got from people in Europe? Are they on edge?
Well, I should say I was in London. I was not in Paris. I was planning to go to Paris 2 days after the attack took place and change those plans. Not because I was particularly afraid of further attacks, but simply because of the memorial marches that were planned that really tied up the center of Paris. I mean, and on that Saturday and Sunday, there were something like 3.5 million people that went into the streets all around France, the largest protests in the country's history. I mean, that's an incredible number when you think about the fact this is a country that's not nearly the size of the U.S.
Yeah, look at that. That's one of the protest pictures right there. That took place just a day or two after the mass killing. 17 people died in all, including, if you want to include the terrorists as well. But is there a sense that people are on edge over there, that there's more to come?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a sense that Europe is on edge for a long time, and this is a continent that has a very unique relationship with the Islamic world because of imperialism. Much of the Islamic world was physically, politically dominated by European powers. So the result of that has been that there is obviously a historical resentment. There's historical factions that have built up there, and there's also very, very large populations of people there that have come in from the former empire of all faiths. I mean, Muslim, Hindu, whatever it is, but they have a much different historical relationship with that part of the world than the United States does in that sense, and that's where a lot of the sort of tensions come from. I mean, I think it's easy to overplay the dangers here. I mean, the odds of being killed in a terrorist attack are still extremely low, right? I mean, there are many things
even in Europe, huh?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the easiest way to sort of die prematurely in any country is accidents, right? Auto accidents, things like that kill people on a daily basis. The fact that 17 people have died in France is an awful, awful thing, but it's not an existential threat necessarily to the entire fabric of the state in that capacity.
Well, okay, when you look at it from that standpoint, I guess it's true, but is the population, is it more than double here in the United States, Muslims I'm talking about, because of the proximity to the Middle East?
In terms of proportion of population?
Yes.
Oh, certainly probably more than that, I would think. Yeah, absolutely.
More than double?
More than double what it is in the United States. Yeah, I would think so proportionally. I don't know those numbers offhand, but yes, it is a larger population in that sense.
Do they have a greater sense of tightening security, more so than we do here, or no?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, whenever an attack like this takes place, everyone tightens security in that way. I mean, when I was in London, it was palpable that after this attack had taken place, there was more security on display. I mean, I was actually in London during the 2005 bombings of the London Underground, and that was the tightest security that I've ever seen anywhere. I mean, there were literally, on every train, armed police. with not just handguns, but very serious weaponry.
Are they sitting targets over there more so than we are?
Well, I mean, sitting
to a certain extent?
To a certain extent. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, the Europeans have obviously developed a huge state security apparatus to protect against this. We have to keep in mind that Britain especially has a much longer tradition of dealing with terrorism than this country does because of the Irish Republican Army, which launched terrorist attacks from the 1920s onward.
Yep.
I mean, I can even remember within my lifetime being there and experiencing IRA bomb threats against things. That really only ended in the late 1990s. So it's a very different experience with terrorism, I think, and it's something that people have just sort of become accustomed to living with, the idea that there are bad people who will potentially do bad things if they can, in that sense.
Yeah, it depends on the timing.
Absolutely.
If you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, it's like being in the Middle East. When I went to Jerusalem, same thing. There were bus bombings going on all over the place, but right time, right place, I mean, timing has everything to do with it. Bradley Hart is our guest, journalism professor at Fresno State and certainly a media expert. He teaches over there at the university. 436-ME-TV, option 11. Dr. Thomas Casagrande is our sponsor today. We got an open line. Call in, no problem. See you back here in just a moment.
Frigidaire. It means the first electric refrigerator. The first compact electric range. Now, there's the Frigidaire Gallery Range with Symmetry double ovens. It's designed to cook multiple dishes at multiple temperatures, so you can prepare the entire meal at the same time. Frigidaire, over 90 years of legendary innovation.
See the full line of Frigidaire appliances at Ventura TV Electronics and Appliances.
Back here with Bradley Hart, our thanks to Thomas Casagrande, the doctor over there at 2020 Optometrics. And Bradley, you were talking about this, the Charlie Hebdo thing. I do want to run, I want to put some pictures up on the screen of one person who is still on the loose. Her boyfriend, of course, Koulibaly, is dead. He died in that shootout. She is Hayat Boumediene, I think her name is. Amity Koulibaly, of course, died in that shootout. But Hayat is still on the loose. They think she's in Syria. Do you think she'll ever be captured at this point?
Well, I mean, certainly when I was in Europe, the European papers are speculating that she probably never will. Once you go into the sort of ISIS-controlled territory, there's almost no way of, essentially no external government control. So probably not would be the suggestion.
So she's on the run, and she's with ISIS maybe right now. Nobody knows where she is. She's in Syria someplace doing something. So the chances are, and the odds are, slim to none, unless she comes back to Europe and.
Seems very unlikely, doesn't it?
Seems very unlikely. And then what about the two? What did you learn over there by just being over there in London about the two Kawachi brothers, Saeed and Sharif? We'll put their pictures up on the screen here.
Well, I mean, I think relatively little is known about them still. We know that both of these men, or at least one of them, had a criminal record previously. And this is the question that's emerging about this particular case, is what did the authorities really know about these people? And it is a classic question of sort of counterterrorism. You can't surveil everyone who's questionable. And it appeared that these guys sort of were in trouble at one point, went off the radar, and then obviously reappeared in a particularly horrendous way. So this is the challenge that our intelligence agencies, all of the intelligence agencies really face, is who poses a threat and how do you surveil a huge number of people?
That's right. One of these brothers went off the radar, went to Yemen, then came back, and they lost track of him for like 2 or 3 years.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, he didn't show up at any point, right? He appeared to be a law-abiding citizen, but obviously wasn't in retrospect. And the other threat that poses, or that is posed here, is people who have actually gone to fight in Syria and Iraq with ISIS. This is something that Devin Nunes, our congressman, now the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, has talked about on this program, is that there are literally thousands of people from the U.S. and Europe that have gone to fight and gotten significant combat experience in these places, and they could come back at some point, or will come back at some point.
And how do you track them? That's the question.
How do you track them? And you cannot deny them entry. If they have an American or a British passport, the United Nations will not allow you effectively to deny one of your nationals entry.
Let's go inside Charlie Hebdo after the shooting and show you what it looked like. A mass killing where up to 12 people, a dozen people were killed from the staff at Charlie Hebdo. That's what it looked like after the shooting, an absolute bloody mess, as you can imagine. 12 people died. What do you make of this, Bradley, in terms of the press, the news media being targets now by some of these terror groups if you print or say something to their dislike?
Well, this is not new. Media journalists have always been, to an extent, in the line of fire. They're not supposed to be. There are international conventions that, in theory, protect journalists who are in war zones. But, of course, these journalists weren't in a war zone. They were in Paris. They were doing their normal business. There's a very interesting debate that's raging right now over these cartoons, right? Charlie Hebdo has published essentially a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad. Some newspapers have reprinted that. There was actually a firebombing of a newspaper in Germany that reprinted it. It's unknown whether that's related to that at all.
Last week?
Last week, yeah. So there are some newspapers that have reprinted these, and there's a big debate as to whether or not they should. On the one hand, isn't it the best legacy? Isn't it the best way to honor the memory of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist by reprinting these things? On the other hand, if that endangers the staff of another newspaper, or, on another basis, just causes great offense to people. Let's keep in mind that Charlie Hebdo was also deeply offensive to people of many different faiths as well. It's been the subject of legal suits in the past, obviously not assaults of this type, but this is a magazine that specialized in offending people in that sense. And it's a fundamental question of sort of free speech and a free society of how much offense.
I think they reprinted out of defiance, though.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, no question about that at all. And the question is, should other newspapers follow suit?
Yeah. Caller, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes. It seems like the newscasters now really don't have a sense of religious literacy. They really don't know differences between the religions. They don't know the difference within those religions. It's a sad case when you listen to reporters talking about Muslims and the way they talk. It's like, for instance, let's give an example. Should the Pope forgive the Christianity for the skinheads who attacked in South Africa? Is there different sects of Muslims, just like in Christianity? That's my question.
Well, absolutely. I think the caller is alluding to whether or not there are differences in opinion within the Muslim world. Absolutely. It's important, I think, to reiterate that most Muslims are not terrorists, right? This is something that too often gets lost. Most Muslims are perfectly peaceable, upstanding members of any society in that sense. There's more than 1 billion Muslims in the world. So terrorism is concentrated within a subsect. And I think the analogy of skinheads is an interesting one, and this is an issue that's come up because skinheads, neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan will say that they are more Christian than most Christians in that sense. So appropriation of religion is very different than religion. I think that's an important point that is worth reiterating in that sense. And interestingly, the Pope has weighed in on this case and actually said that that the issue of religious offense is very deeply important to him, and he said actually that free speech should have some limits, that religion should not be held up to ridicule.
But it's satire.
Well, yeah,
if you're going to do that, then take Saturday Night Live off the air.
Well, this is one perspective. For people of all religions, religion is something that should not be ridiculed in any way, regardless.
So religion is off the table? There's no satire in regards to religion?
Well, I'm not endorsing this view. I'm saying this is what the Pope has said, and this is the same argument that's been made in that sense. Yeah. But we have to keep in mind that religion is an issue that for people is very, very deeply sensitive, and that's part of the discussion, I think.
But on the other hand, there are some people who say, look, if you're going to do satire, and nothing is off the table, and nothing is sacred at this point, even religion. I'm Greek Orthodox, but if somebody wants to poke fun at one of the bishops, I have no problem with that. It's satire.
Right.
It doesn't mean they hate us. It doesn't mean they dislike us or disrespect us. It's satire.
Well,
Am I right about that?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's what we believe in a free society, right? That anyone's beliefs, you do not have a constitutional right to not be offended in that sense. The Supreme Court is often held in that capacity. But in other parts of the world where religion is essentially in the apparatus of the state, right? There is no separation of church and state. There is a right to not be offended in that sense, or there's a demand actually to not be offended, that these things will be interpreted in different ways. And that's the discussion that's ongoing about the reprinting of these cartoons.
All right, the reprinting, I got to go to break. The reprinting, will that cause more terrorists to come out of the woodwork?
Well, certainly we hope not, but that is the risk. And that there is a suggestion that that's why these anti-terror raids have taken place across Europe, in both Greece actually and Belgium.
Okay. Bradley Hart is here, and you are there, 436-MeTV option 11. We're going to come back in a moment. Dr. Thomas Casagrande, our sponsor today, talking about Charlie Hebdo and terrorism across the board. Back in a moment. At 2020 Optometric, your vision is their focus. Whether you're 5 or 65, Dr. Thomas Casagrande will get to know you, your lifestyle, and vision needs to ensure that your contacts or eyeglasses are a perfect fit and the right prescription every time. With the Valley's largest selection of eyewear, 2020 has over 2,000 frames, including top designer brands like Coach, Tiffany, Prada, Ray-Ban, Oakley, and more. Eye exams start as low as $89, so call or stop by to schedule your appointment today. Back here with Bradley Hart, a journalism major out at Fresno State. So I'm asking you during the break if you read David Brooks' article in the New York Times, and you just referenced that just a few moments ago. It's a great article. Look it up online if you can, because he basically says, I am not Charlie Hebdo. It would never happen in this country. You never see the New York Times printing a cartoon such as Charlie Hebdo did, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. But that's not to say that they don't have the right to do it. Under the First Amendment, you have the right to print essentially whatever you want.
Yeah, but you'd never see them do it because it's politically incorrect.
Correct. Yeah, you would never see a major newspaper publishing the types of cartoons. And we have to, I think an important point to point out here is that France has a very different tradition of satire than the U.S. does in that sense.
So why would they print it and we wouldn't?
Well, because, again, French satire is very hard-edged. This goes back to the French Revolution, where ridiculing authority, ridiculing religion is part of the state. France is the most secular society in the world, right? Wearing religious symbolism is banned in most public places. It's banned in public schools. The wearing of headscarves for Muslims is banned in schools. The wearing of crosses for Christians is banned as well. It is a highly secular society in which religion and authority is often held up to ridicule in that way.
All right, I have an email question here. It says intelligence, and now keep in mind, we're not Bradley is not a terrorism expert. I'm not a terrorism expert. We have a guy for that. His name is Daniel Payne. He'll be along with us here in a couple of weeks. Intelligence has managed to preempt the Ohio terrorist that we talked about in the monologue. Is our intelligence here in this country gathering finally ahead of the curve? That's what the emailer wants to know.
It's a very good question. I mean, I'm not qualified to answer that, obviously, but you know, it's important to emphasize, I think, the vast majority of terrorist plots are derailed in some way, right? I mean, the authorities are doing a very good job, actually, overall at doing this. And this was something that's been said many times by intelligence agencies in the U.S. and Britain and Europe that you know, there have been many plots that have been averted, that have been where people have been captured, where lives would have been lost had the authorities not been as aggressive or not been as effective at derailing them. So the problem is, of course, with terrorism, as was famously said by the Irish Republican Army at one point, is that the authorities have to be lucky all the time. They only have to be lucky once.
Yeah.
Right? Where literally and the expectation is that the authorities have to be able to derail all of these. The terrorists only have to be able to successfully do it once.
Yeah, and you have to wonder how lucky have we been in this country since 9/11? You know, how many times can luck be on our side? Not that our intelligence and our law enforcement is not up to par and we're not ahead of the curve. It's just that, like Bradley said, hey, luck plays into it as well. I want to play a piece of videotape from the shootout inside the Paris deli that authorities there killed Amity Coulibaly. He was one of the gunmen, one of the I guess you could call him the third gunman, had really no direct connection to the Kawachi brothers. But take a look at this shootout. Bradley and I will comment about it after you take a look.
Visou, et rentre. Oh la vache. La PV, tu peux dire qu'il voit l'image. Je vois une fille, ça y est, il libère des otages, c'est fini. Je crois qu'ils l'ont vu. Bon, les gars, on passera pas la nuit.
All right, this character, Coulibaly, of course, shot 4 people inside that deli, shot them dead before authorities moved in, as you saw there. You were watching this live. Hayat Boumediene, his 26-year-old girlfriend, still on the run, believed to be in Syria. What were your thoughts at this point, and did authorities do the right thing at that point, law enforcement moving in, for the kill on Koulibaly.
Yeah, well, I watched this play out live, as I was saying. I was obviously in London, so it was a 1-hour difference. I watched it live on the BBC. What was extremely impressive, and I think the French authorities deserve a lot of credit here, is that there were nearly simultaneous assaults on the two locations. So the brothers were holed up in a publishing, or a sort of publishing house.
Kouachi brothers were 30 miles to the north of Paris.
Right, so so I watched it play out live, and it was very clear what was happening there, because the assault took place first on them, and then a few minutes later it took place on the
And they had a split screen.
Not a split screen, actually, because the one had resolved first. So the French authorities obviously wanted to secure the brothers, or secure that scene, before they went after the second scene, in that sense. But it was a very well-coordinated assault, and just an immense amount, and this is what all of the reporters on the scene were saying, an immense police presence. I mean, the largest police presence they had ever seen, talking thousands of officers deployed to these areas.
How did they analyze the situation? I'm talking about the Brits, television that you were watching over there, the media.
Well,
and the next day, how'd the papers play it?
Yeah, the media there is much more cautious. I mean, they didn't even report that the suspects were dead for several hours. Actually, the French media were quite a bit ahead of them in that sense. And that's, again, because there's a much closer relationship between government and media in Europe than there is in this country. So they were very, very cautious in reporting that they were killed in that sense. And also the other side of that was that the guy who was in the supermarket had said that if anything happened to the brothers, he would begin killing hostages. So there was an agreement in place, presumably, to keep that news sort of from getting out until after that assault had taken place.
Much different. How did the papers play it the next day?
Well, so, I mean, one of the papers, I believe it was the Daily Mail, actually it was The Sun, which is a tabloid, if any of the viewers are familiar with that. It's called a red top tabloid. Said essentially these men wanted to die as martyrs. They died instead as a bunch of expletives, which they then put on the front page. Right. And essentially called them cowards in that sense. So, you know, British papers are much more aggressive. They're much more partisan. Obviously, the conservative papers, you know, small c conservative, played in a very straightforward way. But the tabloids, whenever these incidents take place, make no bones about calling these people cowards, calling them scum. You know, all of the, and those are verbatim headlines as to what these people were.
It's amazing. So much. You know, they're much more dramatic over there in Europe, in London, and in Paris, and in much of the Middle East. They're more dramatic with their headlines and their papers. Are they not?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember
it's almost tabloidish.
Well, they are tabloids, effectively. Yeah, I mean, I remember in 2005 when the 7/7 bombers, the bombers on London Underground, were captured. The Sun ran a headline that said, "Got the B words," across the front page in size 150
You'd never
font.
see that here.
I mean, you might in New York, but that might be the only.
Maybe. I'm not sure. But so what do you think about this? In Paris now, they're talking about. The government is talking out of both sides of its mouth, because on the one side they're defending free speech, and on the other side of their mouth they're saying, hey, don't criticize Charlie Hebdo, and if you side with the terrorists, we're going to crack down on you. So isn't that a double standard?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is the standard that any free society sort of has to come to at some point. There has to be a balancing act between, and again, as we were talking, there's no right to not be offended in any society type of thing.
Right.
And that raises real interesting questions about, what is the role of religion in this? Because religion is one of the things that people get very, very upset if you criticize or berate in the way that Charlie Hebdo actually has done for many decades in that sense. And there has to be a balancing act there. Again, this is the kind of satire that you probably wouldn't see too often in the United States, but if you did, it would be very offensive to a lot of people.
The government, it seems, over there in Paris and in France is cracking down on those who come out against the kind of satire that Charlie Hebdo put out.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, they've essentially said that if you
in fact, they might jail them.
Yeah. Well, in fact, and that's the thing. I mean, there's no right to free speech in these societies, right? There is no First Amendment equivalent. So if you come out the other way and criticize, yeah, you could be in prison. There's a very famous French comedian who was imprisoned for, as he put it, satirically tweeting some sort of act of solidarity, as it was interpreted by some people, with one of the gunmen. He actually was imprisoned for that. I mean, he was tossed into jail.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is what any free society has to balance with, is sort of freedom of speech. I mean, and to an extent, we have that issue in this country, too. Even though we have the First Amendment, we've seen these cases with journalists in the past few years who have been called before the court and asked to reveal sources, and that's the classic journalistic thing, is if you're asked to reveal a source by a judge, do you do it or do you go to jail?
So to a certain extent, that's a double standard, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the classic thing, is at what point should journalists have to reveal their sources? And national security is the one area where, there is a real give and take. If a source does reveal national security or top secret information, is that legitimate? Is it legitimate to reveal state secrets?
Yeah. Bradley Hart is here. He's from Fresno State, a journalism professor. 436, Me TV Option 11, an open line here on a Monday morning, on the air, off the presses. back in just a moment. Hey, by the way, our thanks to Dr. Thomas Casagrande for his sponsorship on this program today. At 20/20 Optometric, your vision is their focus. Whether you're 5 or 65, Dr. Thomas Casagrande will get to know you, your lifestyle, and vision needs to ensure that your contacts or eyeglasses are a perfect fit and the right prescription every time. With the Valley's largest selection of eyewear, 20/20 has over 2,000 frames, including top designer brands like Coach, Tiffany, Prada, Ray-Ban, Oakley, and more. Eye exams start as low as $89, so call or stop by to schedule your appointment today.
Spinners Records, the Valley's classic vinyl headquarters, carries an inventory of over 500,000 classic LPs. Choose from rock, rhythm and blues, country, jazz, and oldies but goodies. Spinners also buys and sells fully restored, old school stereo gear and LP. You can now get a turntable receiver and speakers for below $250. We carry name brands like Marantz, Sansui, and Pioneer.
At Spinners, we sell memories.
Spinners Records at 639 East Olive Avenue in the Tower District.
On the air, off the presses with Bradley Hart, talking about terrorism and the effects it has on the media. Should the media in this country be worried? Should they be scared after Charlie Hebdo? Are they sitting ducks, or no more so than they were before?
I think no more so than they were before, really. I mean, you know, media is always in a certain amount of danger from all types of people because it sits in the public sphere, right? It is in the public eye. You know, reporters go to dangerous places all the time, as you well know, crime scenes, right? I mean, there's a great deal of danger associated with news gathering. I don't think that news outlets in this country, or really any country, are subjected to more danger now than they were a few weeks ago.
But would it make a statement for these terrorist groups, these horrible terrorists that commit these heinous acts? Would it not be a badge of honor to take out a major news anchor?
Well, I'm sure it would in some senses. I mean, in a very perverse way, that's the type of things that these people aim at doing, right? I mean,
high-profile news anchor like a Brian Williams or a Scott Pelley, just to make a statement.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, but that's extremists of any type want to take out, you know, or attack people who are in the public sphere in that sense. So absolutely. I mean, again, that's the role of the police. That's the role of the intelligence agencies to unravel plots of that type. And as we've seen, you know, in the U.S. in the past few weeks with this proposed or sort of attack that was unraveled on the U.S. Capitol, thankfully, the intelligence services are doing quite a good job at that, it seems. I mean, doing quite a good job at sort of finding these people, identifying them, and derailing all of these terrible plots.
Let's roll another piece of videotape. We have sound on this, and it's the Charlie Hebdo attacks. It's the day that the shootings took place right there on the streets of Paris and inside the Charlie Hebdo offices. That was all drawn out on the streets of Paris just a couple of weeks ago, and just surprised by the way it was carried out, and the police officer there, who happened to be Muslim, you know, asking them not to shoot, and they just shot him in cold blood. You're surprised that the way that they did it, such dramatic fashion. I guess it was to make a statement, Bradley. I don't know.
Well, absolutely, it's to make a statement. I mean, that's, you know, this is violence with a political objective in that sense. It's to send a message. And, you know, I think the fact that this police officer was Muslim played out in very interesting ways in Europe. I mean, his family came out in the days following his death and said, essentially, these are terrorists, not Muslims at all, and said essentially that the people who'd been killed at Charlie Hebdo were the true martyrs in that sense. This is martyrdom for essentially the secular state.
Yeah, and you know, the fact of the matter is, the way that they charged into the Charlie Hebdo offices, you know, that was unseen. That was behind, you know, the four corners of the walls there. They were having a meeting. What does that tell you of how they carried out these attacks? What does that tell you about these terrorists, other than the fact that they wanted to make a statement? And you know, that was not in public view. That was behind closed doors where a dozen people were shot and killed.
Yeah.
But the way they carried out the attacks What does that tell you, Bradley?
Well, I mean, it tells me a couple of things. Number one, I mean, they obviously do want to send a message, as you've said, want to instill fear in other people. And I mean, that goes into the discussion as to whether these cartoons should be reprinted. If you don't reprint them, you could argue the terrorists have won to some capacity, right? The fact that there is self-censorship, intimidation, all of those factors begin to play in. So obviously want to send a message, want to intimidate, and also just are highly motivated in that sense. I mean, again, I think one interesting fact about this case is the amount of firepower that these guys were able to obtain. I mean, weaponry is far more difficult to obtain in France than it is in the United States, certainly. Is
it really?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and yet these guys got a hold of AK-47s and pretty sophisticated weaponry in that sense for Europe. So that tells me that there's some sort of wider network probably that was at play here that at least got these weapons, got the ammunition to these people. And we don't know, what the extent of involvement from ISIS itself may have been in that. I mean, obviously that may have been one source of this material.
Of course, making fun of the Prophet Muhammad, certainly not a good thing in the eyes of the terrorists, but let's put up something that was printed just a day or so after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and it's the Twin Towers, two pencils going up, depicting obviously the Twin Towers in New York with a plane going into one of the towers. What'd you make of this when you first saw it?
Well, the pencil, I think, has become the symbol of sort of resistance in this sense. At the Memorial March in Paris, there were, literally millions of people holding up pencils as a sign of resistance in that sense.
That's their weapon.
Well, it's their weapon. I mean, and it plays into the famous saying that the pen is mightier than the sword in that sense, right? That you can overcome the, physical force, you can overcome military force by satire, by sort of free speech in that sense. So this has obviously become the symbol of resistance in that capacity. And it's a very interesting one. I mean, for a lot of people, the pencil is seen as sort of an old-fashioned thing. So, maybe a lot of happy pencil manufacturers out there with all these people buying pencils suddenly.
Yeah, it's an old-fashioned statement. There's no question about that, but certainly depicting a beautiful picture of defiance and saying, look, you might try to instill fear, you might try to intimidate us, you might shoot us again, you might blow up another building, you might kill more people, but that statement tells me right there, we are not backing down. Isn't that what that tells you?
Well, absolutely, yeah. And I think you have to look at what happened in the actual march in Paris, where you had the heads of state of virtually every European country there, African countries, Middle Eastern countries, all marching together. I mean, that is very rare to happen in Europe. I mean, the last time that I can think of it happening offhand is Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901, where you literally have the head of Germany, France, and Britain all marching arm in arm. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's almost unprecedented.
Yeah. What do you make of our government not being represented in that march? Benjamin Netanyahu was there. Other heads of political states were there. We weren't there. Why?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, the Obama administration had the Attorney General, Eric Holder, was in Paris, did not show up to that march. John Kerry didn't show up to that march. Barack Obama didn't show up.
I think we dropped the ball?
Well, it's possible. I mean, I think you have an interesting discussion there. If you send the president or the vice president, that changes the security situation quite dramatically, even from European heads of state. But why did Eric Holder not go to this march? It's an interesting question. I mean, again, the administration hasn't really offered an answer to that. I think John Kerry said that he was in India, I believe, and didn't want to break his previous commitments type of thing. So whether or not you buy that explanation...
But Holder was right there.
Holder was right there. I mean, I think there is an interesting question to answer there. I think one interesting aspect of this would be it's possible that there would have been the accusation that America was trying to steal France's steam in that sense. But whether or not you accept that explanation, I don't know.
Well, one of the explanations I heard too and read about in some of the papers, and that was that the president requires and demands so much security it would have been a disruption.
I think that's true. I mean, certainly any place that President Obama goes requires a huge amount of security, or I mean, obviously the vice president as well. I mean, there was a shooting outside of Joe Biden's house this weekend. I mean, just a further illustration as to how much security these types of people involve. So, I tend to accept that explanation in the sense that obviously sending an entire Secret Service detail would have been a huge complication on top of this. On the other hand, you have American officials who were already there, who are cabinet level officials. Why did they not take part? We really don't know. I mean, there's an interesting question.
Bradley,
there.
You have a unique perspective, and I'm glad you're here today because, let's take a break first, and we'll talk about that on the other side. I was going to pose a question, but short on time. So 436 Me TV option 11. Thanks to Dr. Thomas Casagrande for the sponsorship. Back in a moment.
This fall, there is a place, familiar and inviting, timeless and warm. Me TV, a place all your own that you can call home.
Hi, honey, I'm home.
This fall, home is where you'll find me.
You mean to tell me that's all there is to it? So?
MeTV Fresno, channel 43.6 and Xfinity 187.
Bradley Hart is here and talking about your unique perspective. Can you drop the differences between how our media here in this country perceives things, reports things, as opposed to our friends across the pond?
In what sense? Sort of just generally?
Terrorism.
Well, you know, I think there are important differences. In Europe, you know, this is seen as a threat that can be mitigated in that sense. In this country, the media often portrays this as something that is obviously a very important thing, which it is, and there's no question about that. But in Europe, you know, I think there's this longer tradition of dealing with this. Remember that France, Britain have dealt with terrorism for really almost a century now, and in Britain's case, more than a century in that sense. France had terrible terrorist attacks related to the war in Algeria that was fought all the way in the 1960s by both the left and the right.
But is there a difference in the way that we report it and observe it and perceive it as opposed to how they do it there? Well, I'm talking about their media.
Yeah, I think it's more tempered in Europe. I think that European media tend to not downplay but try to contextualize these types of events much more. Yeah, much more than our media tend to in that sense. Again,
is it because they're tied to the government more than we are?
Tied to the government more. I mean, yeah, you know, in Britain it is unlawful actually to report on trials before they come to a conclusion. So there are trials going on.
Really?
Yeah, so I mean there are terrorism trials that go on that are not reported in the media until they come to a verdict in that sense.
That's amazing.
So yeah, absolutely. So there's no sort of day-to-day coverage. There's no coverage of what goes on in courtrooms necessarily. There are no cameras in courtrooms. I mean, there are arrests.
No commentary.
No commentary. Yeah. I mean, you'll see cases where people are arrested and not named in the press, which is something that would be almost unheard of in this country, right? Yeah. And some of that is sort of self-restraint on the part of media outlets, but there also are laws in place that protect the legal process until it comes to a conclusion.
That's amazing, because with all the tabloids in Europe, you would think it would be exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
It's you know, it's just amazing that they don't report on some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember very well there was a major terrorism case in the UK where it was not even reported that the arrests had taken place until the men had been convicted. So, I mean, this was a case of pure self-restraint where it had perhaps been reported that there had been an anti-terror raid, but not that a trial had really begun. Or in some cases, the trial has begun and just people aren't named who are actually the defendants.
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time in Europe, some, but not as much as you, of course. You lived over there. You lived in London, right, at some point, didn't you?
I did. I lived in Britain for a number of years.
Yeah, for a number of years. And so, you know, I have this vision of them being the paparazzi more so than we are here, but you're saying not the case.
Well, not the case for...
Depends on the circumstances.
Depends on the circumstances, right? I mean, celebrity culture still exists. You know, anything involving the royals, obviously. Tons of paparazzi, tons of tabloids. But no, I mean, there are actual legal standards in place. And this is one issue, I mean, to take it a different direction slightly, but the Rupert Murdoch case involving phone tapping over there.
Oh, sure.
I mean, that's an ongoing thing, but that's
still going on over there?
Oh, absolutely still going on. I mean, there's still inquiries being made into that. But, you know, they have a different legal system in which things can happen in secret. We explicitly in the Constitution forbid these types of inquiries, but they can put together parliamentary inquiries where there are secret investigations, there are never results revealed, there are trials that go on entirely behind closed doors without juries involved. I mean, that's fully a part of their legal system.
So is somebody still investigating the Princess Diana accident?
I don't know about that. I mean, there's been a number of reports
on that. That was a long time ago.
But there is actually, interestingly, an ongoing inquiry into the Iraq War that's been ongoing now for nearly 10 years.
Really?
Yeah, it's never reported any results in the public sphere. And this is the ongoing sort of controversy where there are commentators saying it's called the Chilcot inquiry into Tony Blair's administration. They've interviewed loads of witnesses, probably thousands of witnesses at this point.
And this is ongoing?
It's ongoing. Well, if it isn't ongoing...
It's an open investigation?
It's an open investigation. There's been no report filed in the public, at least.
And you don't hear about it in the papers.
Well, you hear about it in the papers because people are saying, where's the results?
But that's the extent that you hear.
Right, exactly. There's been nothing leaked as to what's in there, effectively. So
that's pretty amazing.
But they have incredible powers to do these types of investigations, and that can be very useful in these types of terrorism cases where you can put people on trial without it ever being publicly revealed.
Right. Do you think there are that maybe London and Paris and maybe all of Europe is more of a target than we are at this point? You saw what happened on Friday. I mean, this Belgium thing really is very disturbing because they were planning on killing law enforcement, and the attack was going to be widespread. It was going to go into France and into Germany.
Yes.
So it seems like that whole area there, close proximity, these three countries, are they more of a target than we are to a certain extent?
I don't know about more of a target. I mean, it also went into Greece, incidentally, which is very interesting because Greece is particularly unstable at the moment politically, so it's sort of unclear how that would have played out. I think they're not necessarily more of a target, but you do have a lot of extremists in Europe. I mean, you have a lot of extremists in this country too, obviously, but, you know, there are reasons why Europe has a greater amount of political extremism and always has in that sense. In France, I mean, there are different citizenship requirements, right? You're not a citizen if you're born in France necessarily. You have to be of French ancestry. So they have huge numbers of people who are disenfranchised who have lived in these countries their entire lives but are not part of the civic state.
Yeah, they're not citizens.
Yeah, there's no birthright citizenship in the same way that we have under the 14th Amendment here.
Hey, we're talking with Bradley Hart. Got to take a break here on Connect with Me. 436 MeTV Option 11. Dr. Thomas Casagrande, the sponsor of today's program. Back in a moment.
Spinners Records, the Valley's classic vinyl headquarters, carries an inventory of over 500,000 classic LPs. Choose from rock, rhythm and blues, country, jazz, and oldies but goodies. Spinners also buys and sells fully restored, old school stereo gear and LPs. You can now get a turntable receiver and speakers for below $250. We carry name brands like Marantz, Sansui, and Pioneer.
At Spinners, we sell memories.
Spinners Records at 639 East Olive Avenue in the Tower District.
At 2020 Optometric, your vision is their focus. Whether you're 5 or 65, Dr. Thomas Casagrande will get to know you, your lifestyle, and vision needs to ensure that your contacts or eyeglasses are a perfect fit and the right prescription every time. With the Valley's largest selection of eyewear, 2020 has over 2,000 frames, including top designer brands like Coach, Tiffany, Prada, Ray-Ban, Oakley, and more. Eye exams start as low as $89, so call or stop by to schedule your appointment today. Back here on the program, thanks to Dr. Thomas Casagrande. Bradley, what do you make? An email question. I want you to comment on Bill de Blasio's relationship with NYPD at this point. Of course, it has to do with, obviously, terrorism, the shooting of police officers, talking about race relations. It runs the gamut.
Yeah, this is a very interesting case. I mean, it's unfolding, and there was a poll that I saw that came out, I believe, yesterday or the day before, showing that most New Yorkers disapprove of this situation, actually disapprove of the NYPD's response to de Blasio in that sense. So,
really?
Yeah, so a plurality of New Yorkers apparently support the mayor over the police force. We don't really know. I think it's hard for us to understand what's going on with that without being in New York City. I mean, I don't have any particular insights into that. I think that you know, de Blasio said some things that obviously offended the police quite aggressively.
Can you blame them?
Well, yeah, I mean,
they're out there putting their lives on the line
absolutely,
every day.
Absolutely. On the other hand, I mean, turning your back on the elected official that is your boss is quite an aggressive stance.
But he railed against them before he was even elected, a year before, while he was campaigning.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, and this is the question. And you know, this poll that I showed, again, I don't have the numbers on me, but showed that most New Yorkers believe that discipline has broken down in the police force. There needs to be some sort of disciplinary action taken in that sense. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the coming you know, months, I think, or even potentially years, because this is an issue that will continue to unfold. But you know, the New York Police Department is obviously huge in that sense. I'm sure it's the biggest police department in the country. I mean, it almost has to be in that sense. So you know, this is an issue that is playing out. Obviously, I think it's probably sort of past the biggest part of it now. It'll probably play out in different ways unless something dramatic happens. But there's been a very interesting issue to watch.
All right. Do you know about the Ferguson thing? You know about how the media covered that? And it was hands up, don't shoot, a false narrative that never happened.
Indeed.
Apparently.
Yeah, apparently.
Okay. Is our media irresponsible to a certain extent by continuing that narrative?
Well, I'm not sure how much media is really. I mean, I think that
they're reporting on it.
Yeah, well, reporting.
But are they reporting that it's a false narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. I mean, reporting on the protests at this point, I think, is very different. You know, the protests have died down a little bit. We haven't seen the same number that we saw before, obviously, but we're going to continue to see this issue sort of come up, especially if we're going to see more cases like this, which is possibly true.
Yeah. All right. Caller, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yeah, can you tell me when the United States is going to learn lessons? It didn't learn a lesson with Pearl Harbor. We didn't learn a lesson with Twin Towers. When are we going to get aggressive and show these people we mean business? As long as we pamper them, they're going to take advantage of us. We're the only country that I know of will go in and take care of a country and then rebuild it up. Let them build it up themselves. They don't have time to attack us then, do they?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. A lot of people think we haven't learned our lesson from 9/11.
Well, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the caller is referring to. I mean, the U.S. has a unique involvement in the world, obviously. I mean, the war in Iraq took place. It took us 10 years to leave there or more. We've only recently withdrawn most of our combat forces from Afghanistan. So yeah, the U.S. has a unique role in the world. I mean, we have the largest sort of foreign commitment, I'm guessing, of any country. I mean, almost certainly that's the case.
We live in a unique time because it seems like, when I was growing up, we were fighting racism, and that was the big issue back then. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, was alive during the 60s, and then in the 70s it was Vietnam, but it was always the infighting. So now we have this unique perspective that we're fighting amongst ourselves. It's race. It's black versus white, as it has been in the past.
Yeah.
But we're also fighting terrorism on the same front. And it's really a difficult task to fight both. It seems like we're imploding to a certain extent and trying to protect ourselves from the outside forces.
Yeah.
You see it that way?
Well, I think one thing that's convenient to forget about the 1960s is that the Cold War is really the context in which this happens, right? I mean, there are many, many accusations leveled against Dr. King which are entirely false, that he's somehow associated with the Communist Party, that there's sort of Russia, right? I mean, these are the allegations that are leveled in the 1960s.
I know.
So, I think it's easy to sort of forget that wider international context, and that's one reason why the civil rights movement becomes so polarizing in many parts of the country, because there are these sort of false accusations being thrown around type of thing. So, I think these civil rights discussions obviously very, very important and will continue to play out, obviously, for the foreseeable future. There are very legitimate concerns in a large part of the country about these types of issues, and I think those are very important to address.
We do have a picture of Dr. King. Let's put him up. He was at the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington back in 1963, a very dramatic photo right there. Has race in general, the race relations between blacks and whites, it doesn't seem to me, I know you weren't living in the 60s or the 70s, but I don't know. I don't know if it's improved or gotten worse. I was talking to your father about this last week. Has it gotten worse, do you think, from your perspective? Even though you're at a young age, you can't speak on, in the 60s and 70s, but has it gotten worse in your lifetime?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think the one area where there has been significant progress, and it's very easy again to forget this, is that prior to the mid-1960s, prior to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it was perfectly legal or seen as legal in much of this country to discriminate. And that's where much of the progress has been made. In the Civil Rights Act, where it's illegal to segregate, in the Voting Rights Act, where, partially now struck down by the Supreme Court, but discrimination at the polls on the basis of race is very strictly forbidden.
Well, it's illegal now to discriminate against anyone.
Right, and that is where progress has been made. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Right.
And the issues come up with how far the country has really come beyond those sort of legal standards. But there's no question at all that with the Civil Rights Act especially, we forget that prior to that there was effectively legal discrimination in private businesses.
If it has gotten better, if we do have an improvement in that area, then why the riots? Why the racial tensions?
Well, a lot of people would say we haven't gone far enough. And I mean, I think there's no question that there is still residual racial prejudice in a lot of this country. I mean, I think that most people...
It still exists.
Absolutely. I think there's no question that still exists in parts of the country. And the question is how far the country needs to go to resolve those issues. I mean, there are very legitimate complaints, very legitimate concerns about this that are still very active. I mean, one interesting thing is to imagine if Dr. King were still alive today. He actually wouldn't be that old. I believe he'd be 89 or 90 years old. So it's conceivable that he would still be with us to this day had he not been killed in 1968.
And I wonder what his perspective would be if he were still here and still alive and still marching to a certain extent had he not been assassinated by one James Earl Ray. You have to wonder what his perspective would have been. Does his message still carry on today, or has his message been lost through the years with some young people who have no idea and no connection to what Dr. King stood for?
No question that the message has been lost to a certain extent. I think one of the most important things to remember about Dr. King is what I mentioned earlier, that he was an equally effective anti-poverty campaigner as he was a civil rights campaigner in that sense. And he said repeatedly that you cannot have full racial equality without economic equality in that sense. And that's part of the discussion that I think has been lost to an extent, is this discussion of poverty. Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s puts in the Great Society program to try to raise people out of poverty.
Well, to a certain extent, President Obama wants economic equality.
Well, we've seen indications.
And he's preached about that.
He has, and we will see more of this in the State of the Union this week. Apparently, I mean, there's some indication that he's going to talk about raising taxes on the rich to try to increase these types of programs. We'll see what the response to that will be. But I think in the aftermath of or on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday, we need to revive that discussion about poverty and talk about, are the social programs we have in place effective? Do they raise people out of poverty? And if not, if they're not effective, if they're essentially in a lot of people's minds wastes of money, what would make them effective?
Less than a minute to go. I want to put up a picture of Les Kimber because he passed away within the last couple of weeks or so. He was a former Fresno City councilman, the man who actually organized a Dr. King March here in 1983 before it became a national holiday. Certainly a big loss for the city of Fresno. And our hearts and prayers go out to the family of Les Kimber. His son Mark and his daughter. A big funeral took place over the weekend. So quick comment, 10 seconds, Bradley. Go ahead. Les Kimber, a major figure here in the city.
Absolutely. I mean, a groundbreaking figure. I mean, a man who has an incredible legacy.
Yeah, he really does. Bradley, always good to hear from you.
Thank
I like
you
your
very much.
insight.
Thank you.
All right. Come back again soon.
I will try my best.
All right. Bradley Hart from Fresno State. That's going to do it for us today here on Connect with Me on MeTV Fresno. Tomorrow, Steve Brandow is going to be here, city councilman, talking about water rates. Are they going up or going down? Back in just about 24 hours from now.